In this lesson, we'll be talking about a somewhat rarer question type that you'll see in GMAT Critical Reasoning formats, and that's a question task asking you to explain a somewhat surprising outcome. So let's first just recap the question logistics for critical reasonings on the GMAT. We remember that they are likely the least frequently occurring question type in the verbal section. There's going to be approximately 10 of the 36 questions in the verbal section that will be critical reasoning formats, and approximately 80% of those critical reasonings are going to be argument tasks, of which explain would fall under, and about 20% are going to be those what must be true inference style tasks. Strategically, we want to assume about 2 minutes per question on average for critical reasonings, the longest average question time on the section because there's just details that you have to note for these questions. You're going to have a pretty hard stop at 3 minutes for any critical reasoning question. You want to note the task of the question before engaging your prompt. And you have to limit yourself to a single reread of that prompt before moving to eliminating for common wrong answers and guessing. This is a question where you will need to take targeted notes to proactively address the question task, in this case, trying to explain a somewhat surprising outcome. And this is, of course, the primary question format to guess and skip if you're behind pace after question 12 or question 24 in the GMAT verbal section. So, how do we identify explain and outcome tasks? Well, of course, there are task words such as explain, paradox, and justify. And a paradox is saying that these two facts are true, but they actually are reconcilable. So we treat whatever the outcome is as the de facto conclusion ultimately in a paradox as we're trying to explain it. You'll want to recognize the presence of a somewhat surprising outcome based on the facts that are presented. And oftentimes, the task for explain questions on critical reasonings in the verbal section will actually include the conclusion or outcome that you're being asked to explain. So it'll say, explain why Jimmy doesn't agree with Sally or something of that nature. Then strategically, we know that you often, because the prompt conclusion is included in the question stem, you can note that in the question stem and expedite your evaluation of the paragraph because you know what the conclusion is based on reading the question. You want to know the details of the evidence because it's going to matter here. There's something that is basically missing already that you need to note. You want to consider your common assumptions to potentially proactively and specifically predict what information would be able to explain that somewhat surprising outcome. Sometimes, if you just think about it, and I don't love using the phrase common sense because it can be kind of twisted in certain situations, but you want to think realistically about the situation, and you might be able to say, actually, that's why Jimmy doesn't agree with Sally, or something of that nature. Of course, focus on your common wrong argument answer choices to eliminate incorrect options. And once you find a choice that matches your predicted explanation, you can, as always, eliminate more quickly. Now, our argumentation equation is going to be slightly different here when we're trying to explain some sort of surprising situation or paradox. So we've got a conclusion or outcome. You may find a situation with these explain questions where you're like, that doesn't feel as much as a subjective opinion. So it's a claim or some sort of result. Again, it may be facts that require explanation, and that's going to function as your conclusion here. Your premise are still going to be the explicit objective facts that theoretically are providing support, even if they seem to a degree counterintuitive. And the assumption, as always, are going to be the unstated facts that must be true to link the two things that seem surprising together. So how do we explain an outcome? Well, first, we want to recognize that the described outcome, if it's facts, functions as a de facto conclusion. And you want to think about the details in conjunction with a common argument to potentially predict what a reasonable explanation might be. So let's consider some of our common arguments and what might be common explanations. So an analogy is just going to assume, as always, that the items in the argument are comparable in some relevant fashion. So your likely explanation, when you need to explain what may seem paradoxical, should show that even though the items may initially seem incomparable, they are analogous in some specifically relevant fashion. For a representation argument, we know that that assumes that the evidentiary sample is representative of the larger whole population in the conclusion or outcome, as it were in this case. So your likely explanation should show that even though the sample seems unrepresentative for some reason, or that the terms in the evidence and the claim or the outcome seem mismatched, the sample is in fact representative of the population that is described in that outcome. So you basically have to say that no, even though it seems counterintuitive, there is a direct reason here. So let's take a look at an example. So we just have to, as it says, predict a reasonable explanation. So we read the question task first before going to the prompt. Which of the following facts, if true, would most explain this fan's claims? And we know that we've got to explain whatever the fan is saying. So we can see the term explain, so that indicates that we have an explain an outcome task. And we know that the conclusion is whatever the fan says. Then we will read the prompt. And so there's a football fan who says, if you ask 100 Thunderbolts United fans to choose between having the Bolts reach the title game and lose to the Galactic Titans, or the Bolts coming in last place and being the only team below the Titans in the standings, nearly each of those fans would choose the last place scenario. So we could see you ask 100 Thunderbolts United fans. So we're looking at a situation where we're taking a sample. So we know that we may want to find out why the fans specifically are actually saying, I'd rather my team do worse in this scenario. So our conclusion is, of course, that statement, nearly each of those Thunderbolts United fans would choose the last place scenario. And we're going to broadly predict what the correct answer should do, and that's to find why the Thunderbolts United fans would prefer that last place option in the hypothetical as opposed to coming in second, basically. So we introduce the answer choices. And as always, we'll process eliminate for common wrong reasons, starting with vague impacts. And choice A also needs additional information, so the Galactic Titans and Thunderbolts United play each other at least twice every season. We need more information about this. Does every team play at least twice each season? I don't know. And so it's kind of vague. At least twice. I mean, they might play 100 times. I have no idea. So this is both vague and requires additional information. We can eliminate A pretty quickly. Choice E, the football fan in the question is a Thunderbolts United season ticket holder. Okay, wonderful. What does that have to do with the 100 fans? Is this guy representative? I don't know. So just because he's a season ticket holder actually introduces more questions than answers, so that can be eliminated there. And of course, we've got task reversals that in this case are going to make the situation seem less reconcilable, less reasonable, as opposed to explaining it. So in this case, if we look at choice B, we've got the last place team in Thunderbolts United's league faces relegation to a lower division. Well, this says that it's really bad to be last, and it makes it seem like, well, wouldn't you rather not be last so you don't get relegated? So B actually makes the outcome seem less reasonable. And similarly, if we're looking at choice C, Thunderbolts United haven't actually made the league title game in decades. Well, then wouldn't you want to make the league title game even if you lost? Again, it makes it seem less reasonable what the outcome was. But if we look at choice D, Galactic Titans and Thunderbolts United supporters most fervently root against each other. Well, now we've got it. And you may have actually come to this, if you're a sports fan, earlier on in this kind of example, because you're like, yeah, we just really, really dislike those guys. And I'd rather they not win than us come in second. So choice D is the reasonable explanation. It addresses the exact sample and says why the fans of this team would respond in the way that was presented, even though if you're not necessarily a sports fan, you may find that a little bit silly. So let's continue with our other common explanations, starting with or continuing with data and evidence interpretation. So we know that any data or evidence interpretation style argument assumes that there's no other reasonable interpretation of the data or evidence. So a likely explanation when the relationship seems unreasonable may be something like providing additional data or numbers in the evidence to show that the interpretation is reasonable, even though it seems surprising at the outset. You'll have a causality. Of course, we're saying that A may B happen. So that may be something like an assumption where no other possible causes or outcomes are possible, and that the circumstance is not merely a coincidence. But if we're trying to explain something that seems somewhat coincidental or otherwise unreasonable, you want to show that the surprising causal relationship is actually reasonable somehow through your explanation. And if you've got a plan or recommendation style argument, we know that that assumes that you're going to execute the plan or recommendation and that whatever the approach is will work and is in some way necessary. So our likely explanation is going to show that an unconventional recommendation could actually be reasonably expected to work according to whatever the defined success metric is. So let's take a look at another explanation style question. So here we've got another, and we'll of course start by reading the question task. Which of the following, if true, most helps to explain why accidents increase after food safety training? So we note the key term explain, indicating that we've got a conclusion or outcome that's going to need to be explained. And we know what it is already. It's that accidents are going to increase after food safety training. So we'll read the prompt and we'll note the evidence provided. So food industry safety protocols have expanded greatly in the past 2 decades. These protocols require extensive training to implement, but executives expect the benefits to outweigh the costs long term. However, in the months immediately following such training, the number of workplace accidents tends to increase. So we've got following. So this is a causality as well as a plan, kind of a hybrid style argument type, because we're executing a plan and we've got some sort of causal relationship. So we, of course, note the explicit conclusion outcome that is being presented, which is that in the months immediately following, we have an increase in the number of workplace accidents. And we want to broadly predict what that correct explanation should be. So we need to find information to explain why an expansion in food safety protocols and training has counterintuitively increased accidents in those months immediately following these trainings that are implemented to expand the food safety protocols. So we go ahead and introduce our answer choices, and we start eliminating using our common wrong argument reasons with a vague impact. And choice B, we've got many food industry protocols have not been vetted by local health authorities. Okay, many. How many? I don't know. And does it include these specific protocols that require extensive training to implement? There's a lot more questions than answers here, and if we're trying to explain, that's kind of a reversal as well. We also have food processing machinery is more complex than ever before. Well, we don't even see the word processing in here. And more complex, okay, does that mean it's harder to deal with, easier to deal with? I have no idea. So that too is kind of introducing additional information, as is the idea of the food industry executives not being required to take the safety training for these new safety protocols. So what the executives do will not impact directly this outcome that we've seen. And we want to eliminate anything that makes the situation less reconcilable, such as choice E, which says that accident reporting procedure is not a part of the most food safety protocols. So that says that we're not just getting an increase in reportings because the reportings aren't part of the training and the protocols. So that actually eliminates a possible explanation, which is the opposite of what we're trying to do. But if we read choice A, we've got food industry training only occurs at the beginning of seasonal hiring cycles. Well, if you have new employees, they won't be up on everything else happening theoretically in the food industry. So that would explain why you'd have an increase in accidents because you have new employees broadly, not that you're training existing employees in these protocols. And choice A, even though you may have to think about it a little bit, is the most reasonable explanation presented. So, how do we deal with these explain tasks? First, we recognize the explain task by citing those key indicator terms such as explain or paradox, and possibly a situation in the prompt requiring some sort of explanation. You want to read the prompt as written, paying close attention to the type of information provided in the premise, and note the explicit outcome that you need to explain. If you have a common argument that is identified, you can more specifically predict what the correct answer should do to explain that surprising outcome based on the type. But if no common argument is identified, you'll just use the generic prediction, apply information to explain why this outcome, whatever it is, happened. And of course, seek a match to that prediction, and then eliminate answer choices that fail to address the task of explaining what the outcome was using your common wrong answer reasons. So let's head on over to the whiteboard and take a look at an example of an explanation task and see how you'll engage with your scratch work to solve this kind of more unique and possibly a little bit more difficult critical reasoning question task on the GMAT. So we have a sample critical reasoning problem here on the old board, and we've got A, B, C, D, E here, and we're going to just put a line over top for the task. So we read the question stem first, Which of the following, if true, would most explain why many farmers remain critical of the tech industry despite its economic benefits? So we know that we need to explain as a task. And we're just going to put PE for predicted explanation up here. So reading from the top, while it is undeniable that high-tech job growth has added billions of dollars to global GDP in the past 2 decades, a more agrarian way of life has been lost in this progress. Nonetheless, those rural citizens who once may have been farmers should be thankful for the opportunities afforded by the burgeoning tech industry. So here we have a, a conclusion, an outcome that the task of the question actually goes against. And this can happen as well with your explanation task. They'll basically ask you to explain why something else isn't really that good. So if we look at our prediction, we just need to find info to explain why many farmers remain critical of tech, even though added billions to GDP. So we need to find a reason the farmers are like, I don't like the tech industry, even though they added billions of dollars to the global GDP. So choice A, we have modern farming technology advancements have led to consolidation of both growers and jobs. So we're at least talking about farming. And if I'm a farmer, and again, you've got to think from a perspective of what is reasonable in real life, and technology consolidates growers and jobs, that's probably not good for me as a farmer. So if we're being a little bit proactive, we might go, ooh, A actually seems pretty good. Now, once you get A as matching our prediction pretty closely, we just want to go briskly through the remaining answer choices. So we've got choice B, continued growth in the tech industry has supported job growth in many supporting sectors. Okay, does that include farming? I have no idea. So that is a vague answer. We can eliminate it immediately. Same thing with choice C. Many rural citizens have moved to urban centers in search of greater mobility. Well, greater upward mobility. Well, do we know if they got it? I don't know. It might seem, if you jump a couple of steps logically, that this is bad for the rural citizens, which could be bad for the farmers. But you're going to have to make a few assumptions to get there. So choice C can be eliminated. Once again, is vague. And if you like choice A, you just go more quickly through that without trying to convince yourself of C. Choice D, advancements in farming generally lead to a better quality of life across an entire society. Well, generally, an entire society are not going to be relevant to our farmers specifically. Generally is vague. An entire society, does that include our farmers? I don't know. And we're supposed to be focused solely on those farmers. And then choice E, farmers have historically been one of the population's most reticent to adopting innovations throughout American history. Well, we know that past performance does not necessarily lead to future outcomes. So choice E is really going to require additional information because just that something happened historically doesn't mean that it's going to continue to happen into the future. And with all of this, and probably a little bit faster if you're not trying to prove out that each individual answer choice is eliminated, a reason each choice is eliminated in a video such as this, you'll pick A and feel pretty confident with it and be able to expedite your process evaluating what could be a harder question if you're not careful. So go ahead and practice some explanation tasks on your own to improve at this specific type of critical reasoning.